Kat, do you
Uh,
know Jay? Like previous, sorry, I definitely am sorry.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Saturday discussion. This is someone who I actually don't know, but at the same time, I've seen a lot and I've heard a lot, and I know they're all great things. This week we have Catt Small, who is your neighborhood-friendly designer, which I'm definitely going to ask about that later on because I thought that was just awesome. She's going to be giving us probably a great, super awesome. I don't even have to say probably. I know it will be. It'll be like the best CSS animations discussion you've ever heard. So, without further ado, now that I've raised the bar like 50 levels, and she's probably going to kill me for that later, here's Kat.
Hi. Great. Um, Hello. Good morning or afternoon, whatever time of day it is. And yeah, the bar has been raised very high. Fingers crossed that I'll do something amazing for all of you. My name is Catt Small. I am a product designer at SoundCloud. I program a lot of different things. I do a lot of prototyping. I program video games and all kinds of things using JavaScript. Yay. But today we're going to concentrate a little bit more on CSS because CSS is amazing and awesome. And this is a feature that before it was implemented, people had been asking about for a very long time. So before CSS animations were actually available for use, people had to rely on other programs, for example, Flash and things like that. But once, and they also had to rely on JavaScript, for example, to do animations. But now that CSS animations are around, people can actually do things natively using CSS alone, and they don't have to rely on JavaScript, which can sometimes be very heavy. And they can actually make CSS like animations like full scale. Some people are even doing with like cartoons and stuff like that, which is really awesome and interesting to watch happen. So it's a very exciting time, and so today we can talk a little bit about how to actually get started with CSS animations. Um, as a caveat, I will note that I'm going to be working mostly in Chrome. A thing to note about CSS animations is that across the board, you're still going to have to use prefixes. So I think Safari might require WebKit, but they might have taken that out for more recent versions. Microsoft has their own. I'm not sure about Opera at this point. The whole thing kind of is shifting as CSS animations become. I mean, they're part of the spec, but now people are starting to move to actually just making them more native. So yeah, no one's sure about Opera anymore. It's kind of a sad situation. But and then there's also Firefox. Firefox is the other one that you also have to think about. So anyway, point being, I'm going to be just using the standard animation, and that's because Chrome is my main browser, and it's really easy to use Chrome, and so I'm just going to go with those. You can note in your mind that when I'm working on this, that you should also include the other browser prefixes when you're implementing CSS, because Chrome is not the only browser out there, contrary to popular belief. Okay. Hi, Jeremy. So I guess I'll just get started. What I'm going to do is share my screen. And I'm going to kind of switch between every now and then, but what I'm going to start with is I'll show a couple of examples of things that I usually work with when I'm doing, or like what I usually do in terms of animations. So a good first example is this site, Al the Chemist. And I made this site for a game with some of my friends, and you'll note that this character is running across the screen. I'm using a CSS animation to actually get the character from left to right and actually to flip them over. There is an animated GIF that is actually running as well, but I can kind of show right here what's going on. So the animated GIF is just a running GIF, and then everything else that's happening is the character moving and flipping and moving back and forth. So you can see right here, there's this animation called Al running, and it's infinite, so it keeps going over and over again, and it's 3 seconds long. So that's the power of animations. And the other nice thing is that it's responsive. So that was kind of exciting to figure out as well. So no matter what width of the screen, the character still runs back and forth. So it's amazing. It's a native kind of thing. You can do so much with it. Another example is when you load any page on my site that's one of the main pages, you'll note that there's like a little text bubble that pops up and kind of flies out. That's also an animation that runs a single time rather than infinite. So I believe it's right here. You can kind of see down here, and you'll also see the browser prefixes that exist right in here as well. So there's WebKit, Mozilla. I also have an Opera one. There's also, I think, a Microsoft one. Sorry, Microsoft. And then there's animation, but they might have just gone with animation at this point. There are so many. It's kind of confusing at times, but you know what? Eventually, just kind of get used to preparing for everything. So this animation runs for 1 second. It's called text bubble, and it runs once. So this is kind of the shorthand syntax for animations, but you can see the longer form right here. So if you want, you can also write these kinds of things out. And so there's the animation name, how long it runs for, the duration, the timing of it. Is there a delay? If there's no delay, then it just starts immediately. Iteration count is how many times it runs. Direction, does it run from beginning to end, or does it go in reverse? How does that work? You can also set it to alternate, so it goes from beginning to end and then end to beginning again. And then a couple of other things, but usually I stick to messing with the name, duration. Sometimes you want to delay, sometimes you want to change the iteration count, and then you want to change the direction. Those are usually the ones that are most interesting to me personally. So I try to use animations sparingly as a note, just because when you use them a lot, it can become a bit overwhelming or look a little bit showy. So the nice thing is that because I'm using this animation only once per page and nothing else is really very animated except for this little button over here, it doesn't overwhelm people. So this button kind of like moves up and down a tiny bit to show that yes, you know, you're gonna scroll up when you press it. And that's kind of the thing about it, is you have to kind of use your own judgment and make sure that you're just not overwhelming people with too many animations and moving things all over the place, because the more things that are moving on a page, the more confusing it can be for people and kind of disorienting and frustrating. So try to use animations where they most make sense and really think about the context before going too deep into it. Cool.
I think you had one question from Jeremy. He was asking, I know you said earlier that you use CSS Animations sometimes instead of JavaScript, but what about using it instead of GIFs? I know in your first example you actually included a GIF and animated it, but is that kind of a better practice of combining the two, or just having one GIF that kind of does everything?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the context. If you're using a bunch of GIFs to kind of express something, first off, there's resolution of whatever it is, and sometimes it's easier in terms of page load to just have an image and then animate it using CSS. It really depends on what the image is trying to do. So it's kind of a contextual thing. Also, I apologize, my cat's like scratching the couch, being a weirdo right now. So that's like any clawing noise you hear. But yeah, it's kind of, it really depends on the context of what you're trying to animate. If it's going to be a bunch of images layered on top of each other, but you can do the same thing with CSS, it's going to be a little bit faster to do that, because then you don't have to load that image or like all the different frames in that image. So if you can animate it in CSS, I think the best rule of thumb is to do it in CSS rather than doing it with a GIF or something.
Nice, and I also remember you showing that that image was also responsive, which is something that you wouldn't get. I mean, the image might scale, but at the same time, it wouldn't really respond dynamically to your site.
Yeah, that's the other nice thing with CSS, is that you can really, you can just say from 0 to 100 in terms of positioning, and then it just knows, it always knows exactly where 0 to 100 is, because it's kind of keeping track of that as part of CSS's whole awesomeness. So yeah, that's the other nice thing about it, is you can really get that distinct amount of control, that very native control that's really hard to get anywhere else.
Awesome.
Cool. All right, so now what I'm going to do is actually share my screen again and go through the process of like making an HTML page and then making, I'll make a couple of different types of objects so that we can start animating them. So I'm just trying to size everything on the screen. Great. So I'm going to start by making an HTML file because that's always useful. So I'm just going to do the usual index.html. Great. And then the process of defining your doc type and all that stuff. Now I'm going to use HTML5, so that's why it's like super bare bones. Apologies for anyone who's like, where are all the meta tags? But not using them. Not using them. So you'll notice I'm just like setting things up. I always start by setting up the head and the body, and then I go in afterward and add stuff. That's just my personal preference. You can kind of do this however you'd like. I always just like to add a title because, I don't know, it's a good idea. So adding a title, animation experiment. And I'll have a CSS file in here later, but for now what I'm going to do is just an H1, and I'm going to just say, woot. I always like to exclaim things in my files. So if I were to open this right now, it would just be a white page with a sans serif font and a giant text, or a giant piece of text that says woot, which is cool. And what I'm going to do next is add an actual style.css file, because this is where the cool stuff is going to happen. So what I'm going to put in here now, well, first I actually have to add it to the HTML, so I'll just say link rel equals style sheet, href equals style.css. Great, now our file is linked. Super cool. So what I do next is I can actually come into my style area in the CSS, and this is where we can create actual classes. So there are two different ways to add animations to things. You can either put it in the actual definition of whatever the class is. So if I wanted to, I could say H1, and then I could say in here, this is the animation you want to use. The way I usually like to do it actually is by creating the animation and then creating a class specifically for that animation, so I can kind of apply it to anything if I want to later. It really depends on the situation and how much you might use that animation. But first, let's just try making a very simple one. We're going to do a font size change from 0 pixels to 32 pixels, make it really simple. So what you do first is you need to actually define the keyframes, and keyframes are the different frames that are going to be in your animation. So the first one's going to look a certain way, and then after that it's going to change to something else. You can have a number of different frames in your animation, but let's just start very simply. Okay, great. Frames, and I'm going to call this scale up, and you'll notice I'm using camel case. That's just my personal thing. When it comes to this, you can use dashes, you can use whatever reference you like. So there are a couple of ways to do this. You can either say from blah and then to blah, but I like doing 0% and then 100%, because then you can also put in like 5%, 10%, like what's happening in between 0 and 100%. So it's kind of nice to use that instead of the classic animation from and to. So what I'm going to do is say font size 0, and then I'm like saving maniacally, sorry, it's like a habit. And then I'm going to go to 32 pixels. Great. So this is our animation, and you can actually call this animation at any time you want. So let's just start by saying H1. So I'll use this one first. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the animation is going to be scale up, and I want it to run for 1.5 seconds, and I want it to run a single time. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this file, And I just got to locate it on my computer. It's on my desktop, so that's fairly easy. And fingers crossed. So let me share what it looks like. So it runs a single time, so I load the page and it's like, woot, woot, woot. Yeah, so you can keep reloading it. But what if you want it to actually show up more than once? So that's a really important question. So if you want it to show up more than a single time, what you do is you actually put infinite instead of 1. And if you want it to go back and forth, then you would put alternate. So let's see what happens here. If I put those two things, then let's just reload the page here. Woo! Now you basically have a marquee sign. So fun stuff. And this is a really simple, just changing font size from 0 to 32. You could get really complicated and do like 0 to 16 to like 25. So for example, let's actually just try doing it. Great. So let's put in like 15% and say font size 24 pixels. And then maybe we want it to go back to 0, so I'll just copy this, and then I'm going to put it here that this will be at 30%. So we're going to bring it back down to 0. And then we're going to come in and we're going to say at 60%, it's going to be at 100 pixels. And then now you can just kind of see where this goes. But that's the fun thing about this, is you can really experiment and see like what's working, what's not working, how funky can I make this, and what does that look like. So let's just see what that looks like and have fun for a second. So I'm reloading. Woo, 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 woo. So this is with the reverse infinite everything going on. You can kind of see it's like all over the place. Why this is useful is I have this site here that's my thesis project that I'm still working on, and you'll notice that when I load the page, like things grow a little bit, and then this kind of like wiggles a bit. Now this is using this concept of animations and the concept that it just kind of, let me just kind of load that in, yeah. So it's this animation that's called wiggle. So if I go into the main CSS, I'm pretty sure I can locate it pretty quickly. Yeah. So what I did is I went in and I was like, okay, how much should this thing shake and rotate? And then I just kind of applied it to 25, 40, 50, 60, and so on, just kind of rotating it appropriately. Until it really looked smooth in the way that I wanted it to look. And again, these are the only two things I'm animating on the page, and it's only the first page as well, so it's like the home page. So I'm really using it sparingly, but like it's a little way of kind of being friendly and just introducing you to the experience. This, on the other hand, kind of intense. You really don't want to do this. But it's a good way of showing an example of like how in control you can be of CSS.
So those animations, do the more animations that you put in, does that affect your load time? I mean, to like a noticeable amount?
I mean, I believe if you put too many in, it can, over time, it can definitely, I believe, like what do you call it, kind of affect the experience of the page. I've never really done that just because I don't use animations to the point where it's overloading, but there's also just a mental overload of having so many things moving on the screen that it's kind of hard to concentrate on one, which for that reason, when I start adding other elements, I'm only going to be moving one at a time, just because it can be a little hard to process if everything's moving at the same time. But yeah, I mean, it definitely affects over time, like a lot of CSS things do. For example, if you ever use drop shadows a ton, there was a time period when there were so many things that had drop shadows on them that it would become too much for the page and it would just have a hard time processing things. So definitely a possibility. that you could like overload the page just by using too many animations at the same time.
Okay. Another question that I had was, do you know if this works well with mobile or?
Yes, so it works really well with mobile for the most part. Like most new mobile browsers they support animation. Android's browser definitely does. I've also tested this on iPads. It works perfectly well. I've tested it on iPhones. Like it works great on most popular mobile browsers. I'm not really sure about Blackberries, for example, but for the most part, it's pretty well supported. So it's kind of exciting and a wonderful thing that you can use these and expect a lot of people to see them.
Okay. I think in another thing with that, with Jeremy's question earlier about CSS animations and GIFs, I think that would definitely lower the data as well. So with us kind of designing more for a mobile environment,
Yes.
I think this is definitely the better route to go in comparison to just pasting a bunch of pictures at like a meg and a half each.
Exactly. 100%. That's actually one of the reasons I'm really for using it is because, again, just it reduces the overall page load, and yeah, it just makes things, I mean, it feels smoother as well just because it's actually like it's all kind of CSS doing it rather than using like an animated GIF to kind of get this thing done. And animated GIFs, the more frames you have in it, the heavier the file is, and it's also just a lot of work on a person's end. And CSS, you can just say from this point to this point, and then it just knows how to calculate all that in between stuff. So really nice. Yeah. Regarding, should I chat a little bit about like pros and cons? I mean, I kind of feel like I mentioned a little bit earlier just about um, like with JavaScript when you're doing animations. I'll kind of explain a little bit more about that. So when you're doing animations with JavaScript, there's usually, or with jQuery especially, there's a lot of in-between calculations, and it has to manually apply styles to the actual element in HTML. So it's kind of like doing these calculations really quickly. And that's one way of doing it, but it is definitely a bit more in terms of processing speed, it seems, than in the CSS where it's just saying, all right, start from 0, go to 100, and it's not really reapplying styles over and over again. So that's the one thing that was really interesting is that if you look at a page that's doing, and if I can find this, that would be awesome. But if you look at jQuery animations and what's actually happening to the HTML elements, it's actually like slowly kind of increasing and decreasing sizes of stuff. So I'm going to see if I can find this really quickly, but it's super interesting to actually look at. Let me just see if this does it. Yes. Okay, great. Found it. All right. So this is what I'm talking about right here. So you'll notice that, and I can zoom in a little bit to show this a little bit larger, but when I run this, it's quickly calculating a ton of stuff and applying it in the style like every like millisecond or less than that. So it's doing this stuff really fast. And if you were using something else, like if you're using CSS animation, that's not happening. So again, just to show what this demo actually does is it starts at this size and it goes, and then it ends up there. And I guess it doesn't go in reverse, which is interesting. But it still does the same calculation over and over again. So yeah, and that's kind of how JS animations and jQuery animations work in comparison to CSS, where it's just like start at left 50 and then end at left 100, and it just tweens in between there for you and doesn't keep reapplying style attributes. So it's an interesting point for sure. Cool.
So just to make sure I understand, so it sounds like the animate function in jQuery is actually not a CSS animation. Like those are different, which I never realized. I always thought that .animate was doing whatever CSS animation would have done, just that I can do it in JavaScript.
Yeah, so it's definitely just saying, all right, math, and then put in the actual attribute style is this for like a millisecond, then more math, and then do that again, and then math, and then keep going. So it's kind of it's kind of intense. But yeah, CSS, you're just like here to there, and then it's still doing math within CSS to tween things, but like it's not having to reapply, you know, that attribute over and over again. So that's, yeah, it's definitely saving a little bit, and also just not having to use another file in terms of JavaScript specifically for animations, also pretty nice. Additionally, jQuery, like using the whole, hopefully you just grab the animate stuff, but like having to attach that library just for animations, like you're saving a lot right there by not having to do that. So kind of nice. So I'll also show a couple of things you can do with divs and things like that, for example, so not just font sizes, but other things. So let's come back into this file, and I'm going to just kind of cut this back down to 0 and 100, and I'm going to remove this H1. So as soon as I do that, and I remove the H1 style definition, it's not going to work anymore. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to index, and I'm going to add a div class equals box. So I'm just going to have this box on the screen, and it's not going to become a box until I actually add a style definition here. I'm that kind of person who likes to put stuff in order, so I'm going to put the box definition up here now. The nice thing is that you can actually define the animation, you can define the keyframes for an animation after you call the animation in terms of the styles. It works for some reason. It's kind of nice. I guess it's probably the kind of thing where it goes and looks for the animation throughout the file and then sees it and then puts it in. Not 100% sure because cascading styles shoot, so it's an interesting point to note. But anyway, I'm going to make a width 100 pixel and height 100 pixel, and then so that we can see it on the screen, I'm going to give it a background of gray. So when I go back into my file, it's going to be a gray square. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go down here and create another keyframe set. And I'm going to call this one move, because I want this set of keyframes to move my object. So I'm going to start at 0%, and I'm going to say margin left 0, yay! And then I'm going to come to 100%, and I'm going to say margin left 500 pixels. You could also do something like 100%, for example, but let's just go with 500 pixels because why not? So now what I'm going to do is, so I'll just show an example of how you can actually use classes to apply things to styles. So I'm going to have this class called move, and the only thing that's going to be in it, anyway, it's funny, is move 2 seconds. And I'm just going to do the alternate thing again because it's kind of useful for moving things back and forth. And I'm going to say infinite. Infiniter. Good with words. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my index file. I'm going to add move in here and just checking things. I've named these all correctly. So now when I switch over to my page and I reload so that Woot's not going crazy, you will notice now this box is moving back and forth over and over again. So again, this is an example of using animations. So some other interesting things that you can do is you can also change the way the animation is happening. So there's like some easing stuff you can do as well. And what I mean by that is you'll notice that, for example, this kind of animation happens in a very specific way. And I believe there's a default timing function that happens with it. So I'm just going to hop in here, and now I just need to click this down. Yeah, so I'm not really, I don't remember what initial is, but there's a couple of different ways that an animation can happen. So I'm going to turn off the infinite animation and the alternating one, and I'll show what that looks like in a second. And I'm going to put ease out, and I'm going to do it for 2 seconds. So let's just see if this still works. Okay. Yeah, so if this makes it easier, I'll just put infinite back on. I can also just edit things in here. So now this will keep going back to the beginning. And you'll also notice this little thing here that's like a little timing function. Did I mention how amazing Chrome is? So you can kind of start to see the difference in how these things are happening. Whoa. And when you start to really modify the way that the easing function works, you can kind of start to see how things change. So it moves, it starts out slower, or it starts out faster, and then it moves slower the closer you get to the end. So the cool thing is that now Chrome just has this feature in it where you can like manually modify this and copy this whole thing down. Did not exist for a long time. But
That
this
is
is
so
the ease
cool.
out, right? Like, what?
Holy crap!
Mind explode. Yeah, so I love Chrome right now for having whatever this feature is. I don't even know what it is, and I'm so proud right now that somehow this has been located on my computer. So welcome to the future of Chrome. It's pretty great, but you can edit like how fast the animation starts versus how fast it finishes, and that's kind of awesome. So that's another feature that you get with this, so you can kind of see it slowly ending versus how fast it's moving in the beginning. So yeah, animations can happen. They can be left to right movement, they can be scaling, they can be all kinds of things. It really kind of depends on what you want. You can also do directional movement with it, kind of like I did here, where it's just kind of, I think it's doing like a left and top kind of thing, where it's saying start at left this and end at left this, and start at top this and end at top that. So you can do all kinds of different interesting stuff with it. Again, this is kind of like a margin or a left 0 to left 100 kind of thing. And yeah, there's also translation stuff that you can do with it, scaling things, all kinds of fun stuff you can do with animations. And it's, again, a lot less work on the browser to do it this way than to have to call in a JavaScript file and then apply an attribute like every millisecond. So it's really fun and pretty straightforward to get into once you've been messing with it for a little bit. So hopefully that helped and was clear. But yeah, there's a ton more that you can do. My favorite site to kind of look through is CSS Tricks. It's a really amazing site, of course. But the other thing is that they've got a lot of these kinds of walkthroughs that kind of show an entire explanation of how you can use something, and then it also shows you things like results, just to show you all the kinds of fun things you can do with CSS. It's also really great for things like Flexbox. If anyone's messed with Flexbox before, you're probably familiar with how intense and fun it can be at times, and I'm being a little bit sarcastic, but point being, it can be kind of hard to learn at first, but if you use a site like this, you can just go through and see, oh, look at all these different animations and all these examples, and it's very helpful for kind of getting up to speed with all these new features that are in CSS3. And as a note, this is a CSS3 feature, so it's not going to work natively on a browser like Internet Explorer 8. It's a very new feature, and as I mentioned, with all the browser prefix stuff, you just might not know if you need to use a prefix or not, because this changes all the time and browsers get updated all the time, and some of the rules you have to kind of be tuned into whatever browser, like if you kind of do like beta stuff and kind of look out for change notes, then it's a little bit easier, but yeah, sometimes they just change things and don't really tell you, so it's fun.
In your two examples, both of them are automated. Like you just open the browser and it starts doing what it does.
Yeah.
Is there a way to set that up? I know a lot of these sites, and it just says click to run. Is there a way to do that on like on clicks or like with mouse overs?
Yeah, so that's you can do hover stuff for sure, and then you can also use the active pseudo, or not pseudo element, but you can use that as well. So the active state and the hover state are other things that you can use. So as an example, this, let me show another thing on my site. So as I mentioned, when you scroll down, you can kind of see this thing here. So I actually have an animation set on this button. And I believe I put an animation on it for when it's hovering as well. I just have to remember, oh, did they put it under here? Nope, okay, interesting. Yeah, so there's an animation on this button that shows up when you hover on it, but it's kind of hard to show because it's not doing the thing that, but you can kind of see that when I hover over it, it does a little animation, so that's specifically happening on hover state, and I've made it that way using the hover state. So I'm really wishing I could show that on here right now, but apparently they've kind of moved some things around, so that's kind of frustrating me right now. But, oh, there it is, yeah. So on hover, I have this slide hover animation that happens. Sorry about that. They kind of changed the sign for that. So yeah, you can do different things. You can do on active state. So you'll see here that I have a color change, but I could definitely add an animation to this. And I do some transition work as well. And transitions are also really interesting because they're similar to animations, but I'm trying to look for a button. Here we go. So this button, for example, when I press it down, it does a transition, which is really similar to an animation. But instead of animating, it just manually kind of removes. Let me see if I can find it. So it's a state that you, it's a property that you put on something to tell it to transition certain things. I put it to all, but for example, I could put it to padding and say I only want padding to transition slowly or quickly. So I'm saying I want this to change and transition from start to finish in 200 milliseconds, so really quickly. So now if I do that, then the margin doesn't do anything. So that's why I have, well, you can also do, and then the color doesn't change either. So it's really nice to have all on because then everything transitions. So the color, when you hover over it, transitions really quickly. The font color also transitions, the padding or the margin transitions. And that's the nice thing about transition is it's similar to animations, but it's really about changing of states instead of more like trying to get something to animate and move left or right. So that's when it's useful to use things like transitions, quite similar to doing something like this, but this is really just about kind of moving something up and down over and over again. Well, here I want something to press a single time, so it's probably not worth doing an animation for unless I wanted something else more intricate to happen afterward. Yeah.
So I thought it was really cool when you did inspect element and you did the mouse over states because I'd never seen that before. I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, I like Chrome a lot, but Firefox also has really similar functionality where you can go in and then change the different states that exist on an element. So yeah, there's lots of different things you can use. It doesn't just have to be by default. You can definitely also use animation delays, but doing stuff on hover and on active state is also, it's really useful.
Well, very awesome. Do we have any other questions before we wrap up?
I have one more. So I feel like when you're doing animation, there's a certain amount of planning that has to go into it. Like even when you were showing, you know, like the graphs and the different types of curves, like I feel like I first would have to understand the feeling that I want to convey in my animation, depending on how complex it was, and then go, okay, which type of curve matches this feeling that I want to convey, and then where do I put it? So like how, I'm curious when you're doing something a little more complicated than just, you know, making the text size change, what's your process in mapping out, you know, this is my intent, and then this is how I get to the final product?
Yes, so animation is just another part of user experience design as a whole, so it is really important that before you decide to throw an animation into something, first off, you shouldn't throw it in. It should be planned. Doesn't necessarily, it's ideal if you're planning it from the beginning when you're starting to think about what you're trying to do with whatever project you're working on. I usually try to put in an animation when it's something, for example, like my website, where I'm trying to think of ways to convey certain personality about myself, for example, in this case, or about the game that I'm working on. So it was very much deliberate that I put in this animation. As soon as I said, hey, you know, it'd be really funny, since our game is trying to be funny and talk about chemistry, what if the main character on the beginning screen was on fire in his lab? How funny and quirky and full of personality would that be? So it was a kind of from the beginning thought. And again, in terms of my own website, it was a thought that I had from the beginning. So what I usually try to do is, if I can, I'll actually do a little tiny storyboard, a really quick sketching thing. Doesn't have to look amazing, but it just needs to get it out somewhere on paper or something so I can really think about how it's going to happen from start to finish. And again, just thinking about what feeling you're trying to convey. Is it trying to be fun and quirky? Is it trying to be even serious? So I've got another website, and it's for a game called Prism Shell. And in the background, we have a very simple scrolling animation that is kind of showing how space kind of moves slowly. And so the point of that is to just kind of have like stars and things like that moving very, very slowly. It's kind of a serious kind of a vibe, so it's very different from the other ones where it's a very quick thing. You can also have it kind of continue forever, but it's really about the feeling that you're trying to convey, and you just want to think about that first. It's really important that you're considering, especially with all front-end work, what are people supposed to feel like when they go to this page? How can I make that happen? How can an animation help to make that happen? The other nice thing is that when you're thinking about interactions, so I mentioned transitions, for example, and using animations to convey the function of something. So, for example, that button, it was very specific and planned that I said, I want to convey that this button is going to move upward. So if I kind of hint a tiny bit by moving the button up and down a little bit, that it's going to move the person up when they on the screen when they press it. Those are very helpful hints you can kind of do as well. So it's really all about considering the experience.
Yeah, to your point, I feel like it's really easy to misuse animation, and I'm wondering, do you have any examples or things that you've seen that are just like, don't do that, don't do that, don't do animation this way?
Yeah, I've definitely seen several portfolio websites, and it's unfortunate. I don't really want to name names about them specifically, but I've seen a lot of portfolio sites, for example, where everything animates at the same time. You've got like this one thing that comes in that's all like whoosh, and there's like 5 different lines of text that are slowly dropping down at the same time. And then you start scrolling down, and then this new thing fades in, and you're like, whoa, why wasn't that there before? Like, you could have just had it there so I could start reading it before yeah. So there are cases in which it's very overwhelming and frustrating. Old Flash sites are definitely a good example of a bit too much. The more you use, the more it starts to feel like it's possibly trying to be a bit show-offy. There are some interesting things you can do with animation and storytelling, for example, and some sites have been really good about that. Like there were several different Google sites where they were trying to tell a story through animation, and it was great. But there are cases in which it doesn't feel like the context is right for what's going on. And a great example of that is a lot of portfolio sites where everything has a new animation, and you scroll down and something new comes in when you didn't expect it, and other things are happening, and it can be kind of disorienting, as I mentioned, and very frustrating. So I can try to locate a couple of those, but I don't really want to call people out specifically on it, so I'll try to locate companies that are doing that rather than individual people, and share those instead.
I think that's awesome. That's a really good point, because I know with like not related to developing, but with like music or painting or any other art, you know, a lot of the things are in the subtlety of what you're doing. And I think like ballet, I know a lot of people say ballet, it's like that because a lot of people look like, what's going on? It's like, oh no, if you look at like the little things, it can add a nice touch. Whereas if you make these grand gestures, it can be really, really overwhelming.
Yeah. For sure. It's exactly like that. You really kind of want to just, yeah, I mean, it is basically a ballet in that sense, because the more things that are moving, as I mentioned, how it's kind of impossible to pay attention to everything at once, because unfortunately people are just not built for multitasking in that way. So for example, if you're at a dinner party and you try to talk to everyone at the same time, you're going to get overwhelmed. But if you go from one person to the next person to the next person, then it's a bit more understandable and a bit easier to handle. So you kind of want to stick to one thing at a time. Try not to animate 5 different things at once, because if you do it in a way it's going to very likely be overwhelming for people unless you do it in a very specific way. But it can really, really mess up very quickly. So, I mean, it's all about experimentation. So that's the other thing to really do, but it can definitely be very, very overwhelming.
Well, very awesome. Do we have any more questions?
Hey, yeah, I had a quick question. First of all, thanks, Kat. That was really eye-opening. I didn't realize you could do so much with CSS. Myself, I have a basic grasp of what CSS is, and I can kind of cut and paste something together that sort of works. But beyond that, I don't really understand it. And I was wondering if you had any recommendations as to how to get from that kind of basic understanding to at least a competent level. So that I don't go into a project and say, okay, well, I can kind of put this here and there, but I don't have any idea how to make a cohesive site or cohesive idea together with it.
Yeah, so when I was starting to learn how to use CSS appropriately, the first couple of things that I did a lot of reading initially. So sites like CSS Tricks, at the time it was there was another site that was specifically excited about CSS3, because when I was really getting into front-end development, I'd been working with like CSS2 for a while, but when I really started getting into it, CSS3 was being thought about and not really announced yet. So I think this was in like 2008. And yeah, I remember reading a lot and just going through as many kind of properties as I could, and just kind of looking through them and seeing what they all did. And it wasn't helpful to, like, I didn't try to memorize all of them, but I tried to understand the power of CSS and how much you could actually do with it. And once I kind of understood how much was possible, when I was working on projects, it was then easy to start saying, oh, I want to do this thing. There's probably a way to do that. Can I look on a site like CSS Tricks and find out exactly what property I need to use? The other thing is using these kinds of sites like Mozilla Developer Network is also a really useful site for these kinds of things, where you can actually look up each property and see its full capabilities in terms of the different parts of it that you can use, and the different parts of the syntax. That was really helpful mid-project to actually see how I could accomplish certain things I was looking to do. The other thing is when I'm trying to learn something, I usually try to do a little mini project. So if I'm trying to learn, when I was trying to learn how to use Angular a little bit better, I actually worked on a prototype for something and had a really good time just kind of learning how it works. So I can find and share that as well, but just kind of working on small projects and giving yourself, oh yes, CodePen is also amazing, by the way. Yeah, trying to find a small project to work on in your spare time can be really useful for just experimenting and trying to learn something a little bit more. So you could focus that project on, for example, drawing out a layout just on paper and then trying to accomplish something similar to that layout on the computer, trying to add fonts in and seeing what you can do with different fonts, seeing what you can do with things like Flexbox, which are really modern kinds of things. There are so many more tools now, and CSS has come such a long way from the days of using tables and the days of using floats to accomplish layouting stuff, for example. There are so many more things that you can do with it now, and it's really helpful to just kind of experiment. And really the only way to get better and really build proficiency is just by consistently practicing over and over again. So the more you start using it, and you're always probably going to be Googling stuff. I still Google stuff all the time, but it's really about just getting to the point where you can know that somewhere out there the thing that you were trying to do exists, and you just have to remember what the name of it is. Because it's impossible to remember everything, but it's really just about experimenting and practicing, and eventually you'll say, I know I can do this, and I've used it before, but I don't remember exactly all the things, the properties and the parts in it. But I know that if I just look it up in a dictionary, for example, then I can just use it immediately. So eventually it happens. It just takes a while, and you just have to keep practicing.
Okay, great. Thank you. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right, guys. If we have no other questions, Catt, do you want to plug away on anything that you're working on, anything that you'd like to get some attention to?
Sure. So my site, cattsmall.com, Catt Small, cat with two T's. I'm always trying to write new things. Anytime I speak about something, I put it on that site. Any projects that I work on, they always end up there. SoundCloud, use it if you haven't tried it yet. It's a music site and an audio site. They host different kinds of things. So a lot of people upload all kinds of music and podcasts and interesting stuff on there. Some people have recorded whales, for example, and uploaded it to SoundCloud. I think NASA has a SoundCloud account. It's a really interesting, fun place full of amazing people who are listening to really interesting stuff all the time. So if you're curious about what else is out there in that world of music and audio, definitely check it out. And yeah, it's supposedly quiet in space, but sometimes you hear weird stuff, so you can hear it on SoundCloud. Additionally, I also mentioned that I make games, so brooklyngamery.com is my game development group that I work with. We made a game called Prism Shell, so I believe I linked it earlier in the chat. Definitely check that out, and we're going to be working on more stuff, so thank you.
All right, and I'd also like to thank CodeNewbie for allowing us to do this every week. If you're interested in more discussions, you can check out our YouTube page. And we also have many things going on at CodeNewbie. There's a different event for every day of the week, I think, except for Fridays, because developers like to party too. So.
And we're actually starting one on Friday, by the way. So actually, it'll be like every day.
No more parties.
No more parties for us.
It'll be coding parties.
All right, guys. So thank you once again, Catt, and everybody have a great week.
Bye.